Hello everyone, I'm Agustini Pujayanti. I'm a student of Agustini Denpasar, State Hindu University, major in English Language Education Department in class A1 Denpasar in the third semester. So in this video, I will give some materials about relative clauses, defining and non-defining relative clause. So let's start the lesson. Relative clauses. A definition of relative clauses is a relative clause is a type of dependent clause that cannot stand alone. Another meaning is a relative clause is a phrase that adds information to a sentence. Its function in sentences is to provide additional information on nouns, which include people, objects, or animals. A relative clause is always preceded by a relative pronoun, but a relative clause is also preceded by relative adverb, which include where, when, and why. There are several relative pronouns that are commonly used in relative clauses. This pronoun is placed in front of the relative clause. Its function is to point to a noun in a sentence, which are included in relative pronouns as follows. Who describe pronouns for people, he, we, and she. Whom describe pronouns for people, him, her, and us. Which describe pronouns for things, places, and times. That pronouns for people or things. And the last describe pronouns to designate position. But there are also a relative clause that preceded by relative adverbs. They are included in relative adverbs as follows. When to describe times, where to describe places, and why to give a reason. Here the example of sentences without relative clause and with relative clause. The first, yesterday I met a man. He works in the circus. The sentence without relative clause, but if the sentence with relative clause, it will be, yesterday I met a man who works in the circus. The sentence who use relative pronoun who that describe a man and the relative clause is who works in the circus. Another example, I bought a cell phone. It has internet access. This sentence without relative clause and I bought a cell phone that has internet access. The sentence with relative clause. Use that as relative pronoun and describe a cell phone. And the relative clause is that has internet access. Next, types of relative clauses. Relative clauses are divided into two types, namely defining and non-defining relative clauses. Both are used to provide information with different classifications. Defining and non-defining relative clauses have different essences in the sentence. What's the difference? Immediately, let's see the explanations. Definitions of a defining relative clause is used to provide essential information about a general term or expression. The information provided is information that can provide a clear understanding of a person or thing. A defining relative clause is not put in commas, and we need the relative clause to understand the sentence. In defining relative clauses, we use relative pronouns. There are who or that to describe for people, which or that to describe for objects, where to describe for place, whose to talk about position, when or that for a time, why for a reason, and the last whom to describe for object, pronouns, people. In defining relative clauses, we use who to refer to people, which to refer to animals and things, and that can replace with who, which, and when. Examples of defining relative clauses, I talked to the man who gave you the news. Which man? The one who gave you the news. And next, I read the letter with which come this morning. Which letter? The one that arrived in this morning. Next, non-defining relative clauses. Definitions of a non-defining relative clause is used to provide extra information about person, animals, and things. Its essence in the sentence is not so absolute or not so important. If we remove the non-defined relative clause, the sentence still makes sense. In non-defined relative clauses, we use commas to separate a non-defined relative clause from the rest of the sentence and the relative pronoun that cannot be used. In non-defined relative clauses, we use relative pronouns. There are who to describe for people, which to describe for things, where to describe for places, whose to describe talk about position, and the last when to describe for a time. For example, Santander, where I live, is a beautiful city. My father, who is 64, is going to retire soon. Next, remember the difference between defining relative clauses and non-defining relative clauses. In defining relative clauses, first, don't take commas. And second, that can replace who, which, and when. And number three, if you remove a defined relative clause, the sentence has a different meaning or is incomplete. For example, that's the student who failed English class 3 times. If we remove who failed English class 3 times, the sentence is incomplete because the relative clause who failed English class 3 times is essential information because it defines which student specifically. Non-defining relative clauses. The first, use a comma before and after non-defining relative clauses. Second, you can use the relative pronoun that. And the last, if you remove a non-defined relative clause, the sentence still makes sense. For example, my brother who lives in California is an engineer. If we remove who lives in California, the sentence still has the same meaning. My brother is an engineer. So the relative clause who lives in California is extra information. So that's all for the material. As usual, to practice your understanding of this material, I provide 10 questions that you can access on and answer on this Google Form link. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.